During the 1934 Night of the Long Knives, Hitler's SS systematically executed the homosexual leadership of the SA. But one high-ranking officer was quietly erased from the death lists. Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia, deeply entrenched in the stormtroopers' gay underground, Queen Victoria's great-grandson, was spared solely to protect the royal establishment. This is the true story behind the most scandalous gay royal cover-up in Nazi history. August Wilhelm, known within the royal family as Aui, was born into a suffocating psychological prison. From his first breath in the Potsdam City Palace in 1887, his life was not his own. It belonged to the state, the military, and the Hohenzollern dynasty. His father, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was a man obsessed with military might and hyper-masculine posturing, demanding that his sons reflect the uncompromising rigidity of the Prussian officer class. Aui, however, fundamentally deviated from this mold. He possessed a quieter, more artistic disposition, leaning toward culture and the arts rather than the parade ground. In the hyper-militarized society of Imperial Germany, these traits were not merely viewed as personal quirks. They were considered profound weaknesses. The Kaiser subjected his sons to a brutalizing education at the military academy in Plön, designed to strip away any softness and hammer them into identical, unthinking extensions of the imperial will. For Aui, this environment was a psychological prison. He learned early on that survival in his father's court required the construction of an impenetrable public facade. He had to perform the role of the stoic Prussian prince while entirely suppressing his true nature. The German Empire strictly criminalized homosexuality under paragraph 175 of the Criminal Code, and while the elite often turned a blind eye to quiet indiscretions, a public scandal involving a son of the Kaiser would have resulted in complete exile and social annihilation. Aui became a master of compere, a mentalization, a man living a deeply fractured existence. The ultimate requirement of his royal performance was marriage. In 1908, the imperial court orchestrated his union with his cousin, Princess Alexandra Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg. The public was presented with a grand spectacle, a meticulously choreographed display of royal continuity and duty. Behind the closed doors of the palace, the marriage was an unmitigated disaster. It was a classic lavender marriage, a structural necessity designed entirely to provide Aui with the ultimate societal cover. He fulfilled his dynastic obligation by fathering a single son in 1912. But beyond that, he offered his wife nothing. Aui was cold, distant, and wholly uninterested in Alexandra Victoria. She found herself isolated in a massive gilded estate, trapped in a legally binding contract with a man who viewed her merely as a shield against public scrutiny. While she languished in the empty halls of their residence, Aui spent his time cultivating a secret life away from the court, seeking out the companionship of men. The psychological toll on Alexandra Victoria was immense, living for years as a prop in her husband's elaborate deception. The turning point for Aui and for Germany arrived with the catastrophic end of World War I. The German Empire collapsed, the Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands, and the rigid social structures of the imperial courts disintegrated overnight. Stripped of his royal purpose and the suffocating oversight of his father, Aui was cast adrift into the chaotic reality of the Weimar Republic. The 1920s in Berlin brought an unprecedented wave of social liberalization. The underground homosexual culture, long suppressed by imperial decree, exploded into the open. with hundreds of clubs, bars, and publications catering to a newly visible community. The old rules no longer applied. By 1920, the hollow shell of Aui's marriage finally shattered. Alexandra Victoria, unwilling to endure the neglect and the increasingly open secret of his lifestyle any longer, demanded a divorce. Aui granted it, fully severing his ties to the traditional expectations of his bloodline. Following the dissolution of his sham marriage in 1920, Aui did not retreat into quiet aristocratic exile. Instead, he plunged headfirst into a world that was strictly forbidden to a man of his lineage. Berlin in the 1920s was a city of extreme contradictions. Above ground, it was a fragile democracy struggling with hyperinflation, political assassinations, and the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Below ground, particularly in districts like Schöneberg, it was the epicenter of a sexual revolution. The strict moral codes of the fallen German Empire had been completely discarded. There were hundreds of establishments catering specifically to homosexual men, ranging from refined upper-class clubs to gritty working-class dive bars. For a former prince, navigating this world was inherently dangerous. Paragraph 175 of the Criminal Code remained in full effect, making homosexual acts a punishable offense. While the Weimar police often exercised a degree of tolerance, the real threat came from the highly organized blackmail rings that operated within the city. These rings specifically targeted wealthy or prominent men who frequented the underground clubs, threatening them with public exposure and total social ruin. Many aristocratic men paid ruinous sums to keep their private lives out of the press. Yet Aui operated with a reckless sense of invulnerability. He did not confine himself to the discreet, heavily guarded clubs of the upper classes. He was drawn to the rougher, more volatile edges of the subculture. This inclination towards rough trade, seeking out working-class men, drifters, and former soldiers, placed him in direct proximity to the very elements that would eventually form the core of the Nazi paramilitary forces. The transition from the U and Der ground clubs of Berlin to the ranks of the National Socialist German Workers' Party was not as incongruous as it might appear. The early Nazi movement, and specifically the SA, was heavily populated by men who had been broken by the First World War. These were the Freikorps veterans, men who had spent years in the brutal, masculine isolation of the trenches, and found themselves unable to reintegrate into civilian society. They despised the Weimar democracy. They despised the traditional aristocracy that they felt had betrayed them in 1918, and they operated entirely outside the bounds of conventional morality. When Ernst Röhm began organizing the SA into a massive paramilitary force, he built it on a foundation of absolute loyalty, aggressive masculinity, and violence. Röhm, who was remarkably open about his own homosexuality for the era, cultivated a leadership circle that shared his inclinations. Within the SA, a distinct subculture flourished. It was an environment where the traditional rules of society were inverted. Physical strength, capacity for violence, and loyalty to the units superseded all other moral considerations. For Prince August Wilhelm, this environment offered a potent psychological release. Within the ranks of the SA, he found men who were the complete antithesis of the stiff, formal courtiers of his father's palace. These men did not care about court etiquette or dynastic obligations. They were raw, unpolished, and dangerous. By financing their gatherings and participating in their heavily segregated, hyper-masculine culture, Aui was able to enact a profound rebellion against his own family. Every moment he spent in the company of the brown shirts was a deliberate desecration of the Hohenzollern legacy. He was not just engaging in forbidden acts, he was doing so with the precise class of men his father, the exiled Kaiser Wilhelm II, considered absolute rabble. His formal integration into the Nazi Party in 1930 was a masterstroke of political cynicism on the part of Adolf Hitler. At that time, the Nazis were actively trying to expand their voter base beyond the radical fringe and appeal to conservative, middle-class Germans. The presence of a Hohenzollern prince speaking at rallies and endorsing Hitler's vision for a renewed Germany provided an invaluable veneer of respectability. Aui became a crucial propaganda asset. He traveled extensively across the country, leveraging the historical weight of his family name to convince hesitant conservatives that the National Socialists were the rightful heirs to the German imperial tradition. Hitler deliberately utilized Aui's royal status while privately holding the aristocracy in contempt. The hypocrisy of this arrangement was staggering. The Nazi Party publicly campaigned on a platform of traditional family values and moral purity, fiercely attacking the Weimar Republic for its degeneracy. Yet their most prominent aristocratic spokesman was a man who spent his private hours deeply entrenched in the homosexual subculture of the SA. Hitler was fully aware of Aui's private life, just as he was fully aware of Röhm's. He tolerated it purely for its political utility. The intelligence apparatus of the party, particularly the SS under Heinrich Himmler, kept meticulous dossiers on the activities of the SA leadership, including the prince. They documented the illicit parties, the liaisons, and the financial irregularities. This information was not gathered for the purpose of immediate prosecution, but rather as ammunition to be deployed when the political calculus shifted. Aui, blinded by the adulation of the SA and the illusion of his own importance within the movement, failed to recognize that he was being tolerated, not accepted. He believed his royal blood and his usefulness to Hitler made him an equal partner in the National Socialist Revolution. From his exile in the Netherlands, Kaiser Wilhelm II watched his son's descent with absolute disgust. The exile-led monarch did not object to the violent, anti-democratic nature of the Nazi movement. In fact, the Kaiser harbored his own deeply reactionary and anti-Semitic views. His revulsion stemmed entirely from class snobbery. To the Kaiser, the Nazis were working-class upstarts, a vulgar mob completely unfit to lead Germany. Seeing his own son wearing the brown shirt, saluting a former corporal like Hitler, and fraternizing with street brawlers was viewed as an unforgivable betrayal of the royal bloodline. The Kaiser formally banned Aui from wearing the SA uniform on the grounds of the Dorn estate. The familial rift became absolute. Aui had entirely alienated his royal relatives, betting his entire future and his survival on the loyalty of the Sturmabteilung. As the Weimar Republic crumbled and Hitler secured the chancellorship in 1933, the power dynamics within Germany shifted violently. The SA, which had grown to a massive force of millions, transformed from a political asset into an immediate liability. Rome began demanding a second revolution, pushing for the SA to absorb the regular German army and for sweeping economic changes that terrified the conservative elites and industrialists who had backed Hitler's rise to power. The regular army leadership made it unequivocally clear to Hitler the SA had to be neutralized, or the military would not support him when the aging President Paul von Hindenburg died. Simultaneously, the internal intelligence files regarding the homosexual culture within the SA leadership were weaponized. Himmler and Hermann Göring, seeking to eliminate Röhm and consolidate their own power, actively fed Hitler reports detailing the moral decay within the SA. They argued that Röhm and his circle were not just a political threat, but a corrupting influence that would destroy the credibility of the regime. The stage was set for a massive, violent purge. The trap was meticulously constructed, targeting the precise network of men that Prince August Wilhelm had spent the last decade cultivating and protecting. The prince remained largely oblivious to the impending slaughter, continuing to operate under the assumption that his status within the party and the historical weight of his name rendered him untouchable. He was about to discover the exact limits of his privilege. The machinery of survival in a totalitarian state is rarely visible until it is too late. While Prince August Wilhelm continued to bask in the aggressive fraternal adoration of the Sturmabteilung, a vastly different, far colder apparatus was quietly assembling in the shadows of Berlin. If the SA represented the chaotic, brawling street power of the National Socialist Revolution, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, represented its chilling bureaucratic future. Under the command of Heinrich Himmler and his ruthlessly efficient deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, the SS was actively preparing to dismantle the very foundation upon which Aue had built his new life. Heydrich, a former naval officer cashiered for a broken engagement, was the architect of the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, the party's internal intelligence agency. He possessed a mind that functioned like a filing cabinet of human weakness. Heydrich understood that in the vicious infighting of the Nazi elite, information was a far more lethal weapon than a pistol. He directed his agents to compile exhaustive dossiers on every prominent figure within the regime. But he focused with particular intensity on Ernst Röhm and the senior leadership of the SA. The strategy was devastatingly simple. Hitler had long ignored the open homosexuality of Röhm and his inner circle because their capacity for street violence was useful. Heydrich and Himmler, however, recognized that this tolerance was temporary. They began to systematically categorize the private lives of the SA leaders, transforming their sexual orientation from a tolerated eccentricity into a weapon of high treason. The SD agents infiltrated the U, Underground bars, bribed the male prostitutes of Schöneberg, and intercepted the private correspondence of the brown shirts. They built the so-called pink dossiers, a massive archive of blackmail and condemnation. Aue's file within the vaults of the SD must have been uniquely complex. Here was a man who belonged to the highest echelon of European royalty, engaging in the most sordid, high-risk behavior imaginable. The agents would have documented his preference for rough trade, his financial patronage of young, aggressive stormtroopers, and his presence at the illicit, heavily guarded parties hosted by the SA elite. Every slip of the tongue, every excessive payment to a working-class paramour was meticulously logged. Yet while other SA commanders were vulnerable to immediate extortion, Aue's royal blood made him a delicate problem. Heydrich and Himmler knew they could not simply arrest the great-grandson of Queen Victoria on a moral charge without provoking a massive crisis among the conservative elite. Instead, they kept his file as a form of insurance, a quiet guarantee that when the time came to cull the herd, they held the ultimate leverage over the prince. By the spring of 1934, the political atmosphere in Germany had become suffocating. The honeymoon phase of the Nazi seizure of power was over, replaced by a bitter, escalating turf war. The SA, having swollen to over 3 million men, was restless and demanding a second revolution. Röhm believed that the political victory of 1933 was only the first step. He now wanted to sweep away the old aristocratic structures, the traditional industrialists, and, most crucially, the regular German army, the Reichswehr. Röhm envisioned his SA absorbing the professional army to create a massive populist people's militia under his command. This ambition sent shockwaves of terror through the traditional German establishment. The generals of the Reichswehr viewed the SA as an undisciplined, degenerate mob. They made a clear, uncompromising ultimatum to Hitler. If the SA was not brought under control, the army would step in, declare martial law, and potentially depose the chancellor. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging field marshal, who still held the legal authority to dismiss Hitler, backed the army entirely. Hitler found himself caught in an impossible vice. He owed his street-level supremacy to Röhm's brown shirts, but he absolutely needed the professional army to execute his long-term plans for European conquest. Furthermore, Hermann Göring, who controlled the Prussian police, had allied with Himmler. Together they relentlessly fed Hitler the intelligence gathered by Heydrich, portraying Röhm not just as a political rival, but as the orchestrator of a massive, morally corrupt conspiracy to overthrow the state. Through all of this escalating tension, Prince August Wilhelm remained astonishingly blind. His royal upbringing, despite his attempts to discard it, had instilled in him a fatal flaw: the innate, unshakable belief in his own untouchability. Princes of the blood were accustomed to scandals, being quietly managed by discreet courtiers. They were not accustomed to being lined up against prison walls. Aui continued to wear his brown uniform with pride, traveling the country as the aristocratic face of a movement that was actively preparing to devour its own. He moved between two entirely contradictory worlds. By day, he attended formal state functions, rubbing shoulders with the conservative elites, the diplomats, and the industrialists who were quietly demanding the annihilation of his SA comrades. By night, he retreated into the hyper-masculine sanctuary of the stormtroopers, drinking and fraternizing with the very men who were marked for death. He believed that his presence provided a shield for his associates. He thought that because he, a Hohenzollern, sat at their tables, they were safe from the machinations of Himmler and Göring. This delusion was the tragedy of his privilege. Aui fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the beast he had helped feed. The National Socialist state did not operate on the old imperial rules of aristocratic courtesy. It operated on a cold, mechanical ruthlessness where human beings were reduced to political obstacles. To Himmler and Heydrich, Aui was not a prince to be revered. He was a useful idiot who had outlived his utility, currently fraternizing with the enemy. In June 1934, the vice finally clamped shut. Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen delivered a blistering speech at the University of Marburg, publicly criticizing the excesses of the SA and demanding a return to order. It was a clear signal that the conservative elite had lost patience. Hitler knew he had to strike immediately or risk losing everything. He flew to Munich, personally taking command of the situation. The SD circulated fabricated documents suggesting that Röhm was hours away from launching an armed putsch against the government. The lie was the necessary legal fiction to justify the impending bloodbath. The orders were drawn up in Berlin. Heydrich's meticulously compiled lists were transformed into execution warrants. The criteria for death were a mix of political threat and moral vengeance. The men who commanded the SA regiments were listed. The men who had crossed Goering were listed. And crucially, the men whose names populated the pink dossiers, the homosexual network that had provided Aui with his escape from reality, were marked for immediate liquidation. The SS execution squads, the Leibstandarte under Sepp Dietrich, were confined to their barracks, issued live ammunition, and briefed on their targets. As the sun set on June 29, 1934, Prince August Wilhelm was likely preparing for another weekend of camaraderie and excess, completely unaware that the safety net of his royal existence was about to be severely tested. The rough, violent men he had sought out for their perceived authenticity, the men who had aired him an aggressive alternative to his stifling aristocratic life, were sleeping in their beds, oblivious to the black sedans quietly rolling through the streets toward their doors. The purge was not going to be a trial. It was going to be an extermination. And in the chaotic, blood-soaked hours that followed, the system would be forced to decide what mattered more, the uncompromising purity of the fascist revolution or the ancient protective immunity of a royal name. The dawn of June 30th, 1934, broke over Germany not with the usual summer warmth, but with the cold metallic snap of rifle bolts. Operation Hummingbird had been activated. Adolf Hitler, driven by a volatile mixture of political paranoia and ruthless pragmatism, personally led the strike against the SA leadership gathered at the Hanselbauer Hotel in the resort town of Bad Wiessee. At the same time in Berlin, Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler unleashed the SS execution squads upon the capital. The Night of the Long Knives was not a battle. It was a highly organized industrial-scale assassination program. The primary target was, of course, Ernst Röhm, but the purge was immediately characterized by its ferocious, deliberate focus on the homosexual network that Röhm had fostered at the top of the Sturmabteilung. The Nazi propaganda machine, which would spend the following weeks retroactively justifying the massacre to the German public, leaned heavily on the narrative of moral purification. Hitler claimed he was cleansing the party of a vile, degenerate sickness that threatened the very fabric of the German nation. The SS squads were given explicit orders to act with maximum brutality against those identified in Heydrich's pink dossiers. The scene at Bad Wiessee encapsulated the sheer hypocrisy and violence of the regime. Hitler, a man who had tolerated Röhm's private life for over a decade while it served his political ascent, now kicked down hotel doors, screaming accusations of treason and perver scion. SA Obergruppenführer Edmund Heines, one of Röhm's closest deputies, and a man deeply entrenched in the same violent rough trade subculture that had captivated Prince August Wilhelm, was dragged from his bed. Heines was discovered sleeping with a young SA troop leader. Both men were immediately taken out and shot. There were no tribunals, no readings of charges, and no opportunities for defense. The executioners were the judge, jury, and firing squad, operating entirely outside the boundaries of German law. Back in Berlin, the atmosphere at the SS headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse was one of frantic bureaucratic slaughter. Heydrich sat at his desk, ticking names off his meticulously prepared lists as reports of executions flooded in from across the country. In the courtyards of the Lichterfelde Cadet School, SS guards set up execution posts. Truckloads of arrested SA officers, many of whom had been Aui's dining companions, drinking partners, and confidants, were unloaded, lined up against the brick walls, and executed by relays of firing squads. The blood ran so thick over the cobblestones that the guards had to use hoses to wash it into the drains between volleys. Somewhere in the midst of this chaotic, synchronized bloodbath, the name of Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia surfaced. He was an SA Obergruppenführer, a man of the exact same rank as the men currently bleeding out at Lichterfelde. He was an intimate part of Röhm's circle, and his private life was thoroughly documented in the very same SD files that were currently being used as death warrants for his comrades. By every metric established by the architects of the purge, Aui should have been dragged from his residence, stood before a wall, and shot. But the bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich, which processed human lives with terrifying indifference, suddenly ground to a halt when confronted with the weight of the Hohenzollern bloodline. The realization of who Aui was, and more importantly, who he was related to, triggered an immediate crisis at the highest levels of the Nazi command. Heydrich and Himmler, for all their fanatical devotion to the SS ideology, were acutely aware of the fragile political coalition that kept Hitler in power. The purge of the SA was explicitly designed to appease the conservative German establishment, the aristocratic generals of the Reichswehr, and the traditional old money industrialists. These were men who despised the SA, but they were also men who retained a deep ingrained reverence for the old imperial family. Executing the fourth son of Kaiser Wilhelm II would have sent a shock wave of terror through the very conservative elite Hitler was trying to court. It would have transformed a purportedly necessary political cleansing into an unforgivable assault on the traditional German social order. If the Nazis were willing to execute a prince of the blood, no aristocrat in Germany would feel safe. The Reichswehr, which had tacitly agreed to look the other way while the SA was dismantled, might have mobilized against the SS in outrage. Furthermore, the international implications were catastrophic. Aui was the direct great-grandson of Queen Victoria. He was intimately connected by blood to the British royal family and to half the reigning houses of Europe. In 1934, Hitler was desperately trying to present Germany as a stabilizing, respectable power on the world stage. He was actively seeking a naval treaty and improved diplomatic relations with Great Britain. The sudden, extrajudicial murder of a member of the extended British royal family, paraded before the world press under accusations of homosexuality and treason, would have instantly alienated the British establishment and caused a massive diplomatic rupture. The sheer hypocrisy of the moment was breathtaking. Hundreds of men were being systematically slaughtered to project an image of National Socialist moral purity. Yet, when confronted with a man who had engaged in the exact same behaviors, the regime calculated that his aristocratic lineage was more important than their ideological purity. The rules applied only to the disposable men of the SA. They did not apply to the elite. A quiet, urgent consensus was reached between Hitler, Göring, and Himmler. Prince August Wilhelm was to be entirely shielded from the violence. His name was physically struck from the arrest lists, while the Gestapo and the SS kicked in the doors of his closest associates. Aui's residence remained undisturbed. It is difficult to ascertain exactly what Aui felt as the weekend of June 30th unfolded. The radio broadcasts and the tightly controlled newspapers began to trumpet the news of Röhm's arrest and the suppression of the SA revolt. As the days bled into July, the terrifying scale of the massacre became apparent even through the veil of state censorship. Aui would have realized, with creeping horror, that his entire world within the SA had been annihilated. The rough, aggressive men he had sought out, the officers he had partied with, the comrades who had offered him an escape from the suffocating rigidity of his royal life, they were all dead. He was entirely isolated. He could not appeal to his father, the exiled Kaiser, who viewed the massacre with grim satisfaction, seeing it as the inevitable result of a government run by gangsters. He could not appeal to the new masters of Germany, the SS, because they were the very men who had murdered his friends and who now held his life in their hands. He was a prince, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, spared by the regime not out of mercy or respect, but out of cold, cynical political calculation. The SS ensured that Aui understood the precarious nature of his survival. He was placed under quiet, unofficial house arrest. The message was clear. You are alive because we allow it, and you will remain alive only as long as you remain silent and invisible. The hyper-masculine, rebellious facade he had constructed over the last decade was stripped away in an instant, leaving him exposed and utterly powerless. When Hitler addressed the Reichstag on July 13th, 1934, to legally justify the murders, he painted a lurid, terrifying picture of the SA leadership. He described a conspiracy of degenerates and traitors, men whose private lives were a stain on the honor of Germany. He proudly declared that in that hour he alone was the supreme judge of the German people, and he had ordered the infection to be burned out. Prince August Wilhelm had to sit in silence and listen to the supreme leader of his party condemn the very subculture he had financed and participated in. He had to accept that his life had been bought with the blood of his comrades. He had survived the night of the long knives, but the man he had tried to become, the rough, hewn SA officer who had rejected his royal destiny, had been executed alongside Ernst Röhm in the cells of Stadelheim. What remained was a ghost, a prince who owed his breath to the very men who had turned his chosen brotherhood to ash. The silence that descended upon Prince August Wilhelm's life in the weeks following the night of the long knives was absolute and terrifying. The vibrant, chaotic, and dangerous world he had inhabited for a decade had simply ceased to exist. The illicit parties, the clandestine meetings in the Schöneberg district, the rough camaraderie of the barracks, all of it had been wiped away in a torrent of state-sanctioned murder. As the summer of 1934 dragged on, the physical reality of his survival began to settle upon him, bringing with it a profound and inescapable cognitive dissonance. He had to wake up every morning in his comfortable bed at the Villa Liegnitz in Potsdam, eat meals prepared by servants, and look out over manicured gardens, knowing with absolute certainty that the men who had shared his bed and his uniform were buried in unmarked graves or locked in the deepest cellars of the Gestapo. He was forced into a state of total ideological castration. The brown shirt of the Sturmabteilung, which Aui had worn with such rebellious pride to spite his exiled father and the traditional aristocracy, had become a shroud. The SA was rapidly disarmed, its membership drastically reduced, and its remaining leadership subjugated entirely to the SS. Aui could no longer play the part of the populist, hyper-masculine revolutionary. He was quietly but firmly instructed by the authorities to withdraw from the public eye. His schedule of speaking engagements was erased. His political influence, which had only ever been an illusion permitted by Hitler, evaporated overnight. He was reduced to exactly what Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich considered him to be, a politically inconvenient relic who was only breathing because his execution would cause too much paperwork and diplomatic friction. As the Gestapo expanded paragraph 175, sending tens of thousands of gay men to concentration camps under the Pink Triangle, Aui remained untouched in his Potsdam villa. He lived mere miles from the headquarters where the torture of men just like him was being administered. His rebellion ended the moment it demanded real consequences. He chose the blood-soaked clemency of the regime, living under the permanent, quiet surveillance of the very men who had murdered his comrades. The Gestapo, however, never forgot about him. Himmler's intelligence apparatus did not simply grant immunity and look away. They kept Aui under suffocating surveillance. His mail was intercepted and read. His telephone conversations were monitored. Informants were undoubtedly planted among his domestic staff. The black sedans of the SD would occasionally park outside the gates of his estate, a silent, menacing reminder that his royal shield was conditional. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, operating under a permanent stay of execution. The men watching him were the same men who had murdered his friends. He had aided the rigid, judgmental court of his father, the Kaiser, for the cold clinical panopticon of the SS. His desperate attempt to find freedom in the underworld of Weimar Berlin had ultimately delivered him into the hands of a totalitarian nightmare. As the 1930s drew to a close and Germany marched relentlessly toward total war, Aui became a pathetic, sycophantic figure within the upper echelons of the regime. He desperately tried to claw back some semblance of his former status, writing groveling letters to Hitler, pledging his undying loyalty and begging for a meaningful role in the expanding empire. His letters were largely ignored or handled by low-level secretaries. In the private diaries of the Nazi elite, he was spoken of with unvarnished contempt. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, viewed him as a weak-willed fool. Hitler considered him an embarrassment. Occasionally, he was trotted out for ceremonial purposes, a minor royal prop to stand on a balcony during a parade, a hollow shell of a man wearing a uniform that meant absolutely nothing. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the stark reality of his marginalization became unavoidable. His brothers, his nephews, and the other men of the Hohenzollern dynasty, despite their own complicated relationships with the regime, were mobilized into the armed forces. They commanded regiments, fought on the front lines, and participated in the great, terrible machinery of the German war effort. Aui was left behind. He was deemed unfit for military command, a liability rather than an asset. He spent the war years watching from the sidelines as the regime he had helped legitimize set the world on fire. The psychological toll of this enforced irrelevance must have been crushing. He had joined the Nazi movement because he wanted to be at the center of history, to be a man of action and consequence, a warrior in a new German age. Instead, he was confined to his estates, growing older and increasingly isolated. Ted watching the sky turn black with Allied bombers. The very cities where he had roamed the underground clubs, the streets where he had marched with the SA, were systematically reduced to rubble. The grand Hohenzollern palaces of Berlin and Potsdam were gutted by fire and high explosives. The physical manifestation of his family's legacy and the underground world that had been his true home were both annihilated simultaneously. By early 1945, the illusion of the Thousand-Year Reich had completely shattered. The Red Army was rapidly advancing from the east, bringing with it the promise of brutal, indiscriminate vengeance. The protective bubble had faced authority. That authority had recognized his bloodline. From the strict tutors of the imperial court to the ruthless executioners of the SS, the people holding the power had always calibrated their actions based on the fact that he was the son of a Kaiser and the great-grandson of a British queen. But the American GIs who detained him in the ruins of a defeated Germany did not care about the Almanach de Gotha. They did not care about Queen Victoria. They did not care about the intricate, unwritten rules of European aristocratic immunity. To the Americans, he was simply a captured enemy official. He was a man who had worn a high-ranking Nazi uniform, who had actively campaigned for Adolf Hitler, and who had been a prominent figure in a regime that had just committed atrocities on a scale previously unimaginable to human history. The Royal Shield, which had miraculously deflected the bullets of the Gestapo, shattered completely upon contact with the military bureaucracy of the United States Army. He was stripped of his civilian clothes, processed through a prisoner of war cage, and thrown into an internment camp. The profound shock of this transition from the untouchable aristocrat to a numbered prisoner eating military rations behind barbed wire must have been the final devastating blow to the fragile ego he had spent a lifetime constructing. Justice, delayed by a decade of corruption and privilege, had finally arrived, wearing a completely different uniform. The processing of Prince August Wilhelm by the United States Army was an exercise in systematic humiliation, entirely devoid of the aristocratic deference that had shielded him for his entire life. The American military apparatus in the spring of 1945 was dealing with millions of prisoners of war, displaced persons, and high-ranking Nazi fugitives. In this immense logistical meat grinder, a royal title was nothing more than a historical curiosity. The man who had once demanded the rigid salutes of T'Chai, Emilian S.A. stormtroopers, was now processed as a standard captive. Stripped of his aristocratic immunity, he found himself confined behind barbed wire, forced to navigate the austere, humiliating reality of an Allied internment camp. The psychological shock of this transition was profound. Aoi had spent his entire existence insulated by a deeply ingrained class system. Even during the bloodiest purges of the Third Reich, he had been granted a quiet, comfortable house arrest. The Americans, however, approached him with a blunt democratic pragmatism. To the military interrogators assigned to his case, he was not His Royal Highness. He was a former Obergruppenführer of the Sturmabteilung, an early and highly visible propagandist for the National Socialist Party, and a prominent symbol of the aristocratic complicity that had enabled Adolf Hitler's rise to power. During his interrogations, Aoi immediately attempted to deploy the survival strategies that had worked for the German elite in the past. He tried to portray himself as a naive, apolitical aristocrat who had been manipulated by the regime. He claimed that his involvement with the SA was entirely superficial, an honorary role thrust upon him without his consent. He argued that he had possessed no real executive authority, that he had been sidelined by Hitler and Himmler early on, and that he had spent the war years in quiet opposition on his private estate. He attempted to leverage his survival of the Night of the Long Knives not as proof of his elite privilege, but as evidence that he was a victim of the SS, a man constantly under threat from the true architects of Nazi terror. The American intelligence officers were entirely unimpressed. They possessed the captured archives of the Nazi state. They had the photographs of Aoi wearing the brown shirt, standing on podiums next to Hitler, delivering impassioned speeches that whipped crowds into frenzies of anti-Semitic and anti-democratic hatred. They had the records of his massive financial contributions to the SA in the 1920s. They knew exactly how he had utilized his family name to legitimize a regime of street thugs in the eyes of the conservative German middle class. The interrogators confronted him with the cold, hard documentation of his own enthusiasm. They dismantled his narrative of victimhood piece by piece, forcing him to look at the undeniable proof that he had not been a captive of the Third Reich. He had been one of its primary cheerleaders. More devastating than the documentary evidence was the profound lack of respect. The Americans did not fear him. They did not revere the Hohenzollern dynasty. They viewed him with a mixture of contempt and pity. He was interrogated not as a fallen monarch, but as a pathetic, weak-willed man who had traded the dignity of his ancestors for a front-row seat at a fascist carnival. The interrogators pointed out the stark cowardice of his survival in 1934. They asked him directly why he had lived while his closest comrades were lined up against the walls of Stadelheim. They forced him to articulate the ugly truth that he had spent a decade desperately trying to ignore. He had survived solely because of the nepotism of a system he claimed to despise, abandoning the men he called brothers the moment his own life was threatened. This relentless deconstruction of a carefully curated self-image broke him. The facade of the rebellious prince, the hyper-masculine SA officer, and the aggrieved victim all shattered simultaneously. He was left with the inescapable reality of what he truly was, an aging, irrelevant man who had backed the most destructive political movement in human history, purely out of spite for his father and a desperate need for personal validation. As the summer of 1945 turned into autumn, the Allied forces began the massive undertaking of denazification. This was not merely a judicial process, it was a societal purge designed to root out the ideology that had driven Germany to destruction. The minor offenders were fined or banned from certain professions, but the high-ranking officials and prominent supporters of the regime faced specialized tribunals. Because of his rank in the SA and his highly public role as a Nazi propagandist, Aui was slated for a formal denazification trial. While he waited for his tribunal, the world outside the barbed wire of his internment camp was undergoing a seismic shift. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg convened, placing the surviving architects of the Third Reich on trial for crimes against humanity, the horrific reality of the concentration camps, the industrial scale of the Holocaust, and the systematic brutality of the SS were broadcast to the world. The American military authorities frequently mandated that German prisoners of war view the uncut footage of the liberation of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. Aui was forced to sit in darkened mess halls and watch the grainy, flickering reels of bulldozers pushing mountains of emaciated corpses into mass graves. He was forced to look at the survivors, living skeletons staring hollowly into the camera lenses. He saw the piles of shoes, the rooms full of human hair, the mechanized infrastructure of mass murder. And crucially, he saw the uniforms of the men who had built and operated these camps. They were the uniforms of the SS, the exact same men who had murdered his SA comrades in 1934, the exact same men who had parked their black sedans outside his villa in Potsdam, the exact same men whose regime he had legitimized with his royal presence. He could no longer retreat into the comfortable delusion that his involvement with the Nazis was a victimless political experiment. The rough trade culture of the SA, the rebellious street brawls, the aggressive masculinity he had found so intoxicating in the 1920s, all of it had been the embryonic stage of the very machine that had built Auschwitz. He had helped pour the foundation for the slaughter. By lending his royal credibility to Hitler, he had helped convince millions of ordinary Germans that the National Socialists were a legitimate, honorable force. The blood on the screen was not just the work of Himmler and Heydrich, it was the direct, inevitable consequence of the political movement he had championed. His family offered no solace. The Hohenzollern dynasty was in ruins, its estates in the East seized by the Soviet Union, its members scattered and disgraced. Crown Prince Wilhelm, Aui's older brother, who had also flirted heavily with the Nazi regime before being sidelined, was dealing with his own post-war tribunals. The surviving royalty of Europe, particularly the British royal family, entirely disowned him. King George VI and the British establishment had just survived a grueling existential war against the regime Aui had served. The bloodline connection to Queen Victoria, which had once been his ultimate shield, was now a source of profound embarrassment for the House of Windsor. They erased him from their collective memory. Prince August Wilhelm was entirely alone. He had alienated the traditional aristocracy by joining the Nazis. He had alienated the Nazis by surviving the purge of the SA, and he was now universally despised by the victorious Allies and the shattered German population. As he prepared to face the denazification court, his physical health began to rapidly deteriorate. The years of psychological stress combined with the harsh conditions of the internment camp and the sudden deprivation of his privileged lifestyle took a severe toll on his body. The man who had once marched proudly at the head of SA columns was now a frail, trembling prisoner, waiting for the legal machinery of the conquerors to determine the final value of his ruined life. The legal reckoning for Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia did not take place in the grand, flood-lit spectacle of the Nuremberg courtroom. There were no international press contingents waiting to hear his testimony, nor were there top-tier Allied prosecutors preparing to cross-examine him. His trial was relegated to the drab, bureaucratic machinery of the Spruchkammer, the local German denazification courts set up under American military supervision. In 1948, he was brought before the tribunal at the internment camp in Ludwigsburg. The setting was profoundly mundane, a stark contrast to the sprawling imperial palaces of his youth and the torchlit arenas of his Nazi prime. It was in this bleak administrative environment that the bill for his decade of fascist cosplay finally came due. The prosecution did not view him as an architect of the Holocaust. They understood perfectly well that Hitler and Himmler had sidelined him long before the industrial extermination camps were fully operational. Instead, he was prosecuted for exactly what he was, a premium enabler. The charges laid out against him focused on his instrumental role in the crucial years between 1930 and 1933, when the Nazi Party was desperately trying to shed its image as a gang of violent street thugs. The prosecutors presented the paper trail of his complicity. They read transcripts of the speeches he had delivered in town squares across Germany, where he used the historical weight of the Hohenzollern name to vouch for a movement that was actively subverting the Republic. They detailed his financial contributions to the Sturmabteilung and his highly visible presence at party rallies. Aui sat before the civilian judges, a physically broken man in his early 60s, listening as the court systematically dismantled his life. His defense was a repetition of the weak narratives he had attempted during his initial interrogations. He claimed he had been a political pawn seduced by the promise of national restoration and entirely ignorant of the regime's criminal intentions. He insisted his rank in the SA was merely honorary and that he had possessed no command authority. He painted himself as a victim of the Gestapo, citing his house arrest and constant surveillance after 1934 as proof of his anti-Nazi credentials. The tribunal rejected his defense entirely. The judges, many of whom were Germans who had suffered under the regime or had been forced into exile, had zero patience for an aristocrat playing the fool. They pointed out the blatant hypocrisy of his narrative. He had not joined the Nazi Party under duress. He had actively sought them out. He had not been a passive observer. He had been a highly effective propagandist who deliberately leveraged his royal status to deceive the German public. The court recognized that his survival during the Night of the Long Knives was not evidence of his opposition, but rather the ultimate proof of his elite privilege. The regime had spared him because of his bloodline, a courtesy they had not extended to the millions of ordinary people the Nazis deemed undesirable. There was a glaring omission in the proceedings, one that highlighted the lingering prejudices of the era. The court focused entirely on his political and propagandist activities, completely ignoring the complex driving force behind his initial entry into the SA, his homosexuality, and his deep involvement in the rough trade subculture of the brown shirts. The Allies, who had defeated the Nazis, still criminalized homosexuality. Paragraph 175 remained on the books in post-war Germany. To discuss Aui's private life, or to acknowledge that the SS had specifically targeted homosexuals during the 1934 purge, would have required the court to confront an uncomfortable reality they were entirely unwilling to face. Consequently, the true, messy, and deeply contradictory motivations of his life were erased from the official record. He was judged simply as a fascist aristocrat, his personal rebellion, and his subsequent betrayal of his comrades entirely omitted from the legal ledger. The verdict of the Ludwigsburg Tribunal was severe and deliberate, humiliating. Prince August Wilhelm was classified as an incriminated person, the second highest category of guilt under the denazification laws. He was sentenced to 2.5 years of hard labor. Furthermore, the court ordered the complete confiscation of his remaining wealth and properties. The internment camp was a brutal physical inversion of everything his life had represented. In the 1920s, Aui had fetishized the working class, playing the part of the hardened soldier while always knowing he could retreat to his gilded villa. Now, the grim reality of confinement was forced upon him as a punishment. He suffered from severe heart disease, asthma, and the accumulating effects of years of intense psychological stress. The harsh camp diet and the lack of elite medical care rapidly destroyed what was left of his physical constitution. He became a familiar, pathetic sight within the camp. A frail, exhausted old man struggling to perform basic tasks, stripped of all dignity and entirely reliant on the minimal mercies of his captors. The men he had once idolized in the SA would have viewed his physical weakness with absolute contempt. The brutal, hyper-masculine world he had helped elevate to power had entirely consumed him. His time in the camp also forced a final devastating isolation upon him. He was shunned by the other German prisoners. The hardened former Nazis viewed him as a weakling who had only joined the party for attention and who lacked the ideological backbone to stand by his convictions. The ordinary Germans who were dealing with the trauma of a destroyed country and the revelation of the death camps hated him for his role in selling them the Nazi lie. He was a man without a country, without a family, and without a faction. His royal blood, which had defined every interaction of his life, was now completely worthless. The title of prince meant nothing to the guards who shouted orders at him, and it meant nothing to the inmates who refused to sit next to him in the mess hall. By the spring of 1948, Aui's physical deterioration had become so severe that the camp doctors intervened. He was suffering from chronic heart failure and required constant medical attention that the camp infrastructure could not provide. The military authorities, recognizing that keeping him in custody would likely result in his death, decided to act. He had already spent nearly 3 years in internment, satisfying the duration of his sentence. The court granted him a release on medical grounds. The release was not a pardon, and it certainly was not a victory. It was an administrative disposal. The Americans simply opened the gates and let him go, washing their hands of a broken man who no longer posed any threat to the reconstruction of Germany. He walked out of the Ludwigsburg camp with nothing. His estates in Potsdam were firmly in the hands of the Soviet occupation zone, soon to become East Germany. His bank accounts had been seized by the denazification courts. He had no pension, no property, and no income. He possessed only the clothes on his back and a release paper that branded him an incriminated Nazi. Stepping out into the ruins of post-war Germany, Aui faced a landscape that mirrored his own internal destruction. The cities were reduced to oceans of shattered brick and twisted metal. He was 61 years old, mortally ill and entirely alone, forced to live long enough to witness the total, uncompromising collapse of every single lie he had ever told himself. Adrift in a world that had fundamentally rejected him, he made his way south to Stuttgart, a city deeply scarred by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. The grand boulevards and historic architecture had been pulverized into oceans of rubble. For a man who had been born in the opulent city palace of Potsdam, surrounded by the finest art and the absolute certainty of his own divine right to rule, the physical devastation of Stuttgart mirrored the total annihilation of his internal world. He was penniless. The denazification courts had systematically stripped him of his remaining assets, his bank accounts, and his properties. He relied on the sporadic charity of distant acquaintances and the meager allowances afforded to destitute citizens in the immediate post-war period. The daily reality of his life in Stuttgart was an exercise in profound humiliation and physical suffering. He rented a small, nondescript room, a stark contrast to the sprawling estates he had inhabited for 6 decades. He stood in rationing lines alongside the very working-class people he had once fetishized and later betrayed. The ordinary citizens of Stuttgart, struggling to rebuild their lives from the ashes of a catastrophic war, had no sympathy for an old man with a ruined aristocratic name. To them, he was a living relic of the regime that had brought fire down upon their homes. He was recognized occasionally, not with the deferential bows of the imperial era or the frantic salutes of the Nazi years, but with cold, hard stares of contempt. The profound isolation he experienced was absolute. His brothers were dealing with their own disgraced legacies. His son, Prince Alexander Ferdinand, who had also been drawn into the SA orbit under his father's influence, was navigating his own fractured existence in the aftermath of the war. The family was broken, scattered by the winds of a history they had foolishly tried to control. In the quiet, agonizing months he spent in that small room in Stuttgart, The full weight of his life's contradictions must have settled upon him. He had spent his entire youth running away from the suffocating expectations of the Hohenzollern dynasty. He had despised the rigid, unfeeling aristocracy of his father, the Kaiser, and he had desperately sought an escape. He thought he had found that escape in the dark, thrilling underground of Weimar Berlin, and later in the brawling, hyper-masculine brotherhood of the Sturmabteil. He had traded the cold palaces for the sweaty, authentic camaraderie of the barracks. But in his desperate search for belonging, he had aligned himself with a machine of unparalleled cruelty. In the ruins of Stuttgart, the final irony of his life became inescapable. The rigid royal establishment he had spent his youth running from was the only reason he survived the purges, leaving him a protected tourist in an underworld that had long since burned to ashes. The physical toll of this psychological burden, combined with the brutal conditions of his internment, accelerated his decline. His heart disease worsened, and his severe asthma left him gasping for air in the cold, damp winters of post-war Germany. He was no longer the dashing, uniformed prince who commanded the attention of thousands at Nuremberg rallies. He was a frail, trembling ghost, haunting the ruins of a country he had helped destroy. He was eventually admitted to a hospital in Stuttgart, entirely reliant on the basic care provided by a medical system that was itself overwhelmed and under-resourced. Lying in that hospital bed, he could not escape the ghosts of 1934. He had outlived Ernst Röhm, Edmund Heines, and the men of his SA circle by 15 years. But those 15 years had not been a gift of life. They had been a slow, agonizing sentence of irrelevance. He had been forced to watch from the sidelines as the Nazi regime, which he had helped legitimize, plunged the world into a Holocaust and turned its murderous machinery against the very homosexual subculture he had once called his own. While he sat under comfortable house arrest on his estate during the war, tens of thousands of gay men were being worked to death in the quarries of Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, wearing the pink triangle. The sheer scale of his complicity and the grotesque nature of his survival left him with a legacy that was entirely indefensible. Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia died on March 25th, 1949, at the age of 60. There were no state funerals. There were no crowds lining the streets. The British royal family, his closest international relatives, issued no statements of mourning. The surviving members of the German aristocracy largely ignored his passing, viewing it as the closing of an embarrassing, shameful chapter in their collective history. He was quietly buried, his death barely registering in a world that was rapidly moving on, dividing itself into the Cold War blocks that would define the next half-century. He exited history not with the thunderous applause he had so desperately craved, but with a pathetic, exhausted whisper. Prince August Wilhelm's legacy is not merely a tale of a rogue royal, but a dark testament to the cynical elasticity of systemic power. He belonged to a persecuted minority, yet allied with the very machine designed to crush it, gambling that his Hohenzollern blood would serve as an eternal shield. He survived the purges not through rebellion or innocence, but through the deep-seated nepotism of a corrupt regime. In the end, he traded the men he called comrades for a few more years of a hollow, heavily monitored existence, proving that while elite privilege might deflect the executioner's bullet, it can never rewrite the moral ledger of history.